What is up, my little crime freaks? Welcome back to episode 2 of Mostly Crime with My. If you are new here, welcome. I'm super happy to have you here. Glad you stopped on by. This is Mostly Crime with My, a true crime podcast where you and I get together once a week to discuss all things creepy, sneaky, and downright freaky. We will talk about true crime, paranormal, dark conspiracy theories. There are pretty much no blood-curdling ends of the earth that we will not explore, so I invite you to pour that cup of coffee, pour a glass of wine, roll that joint, whatever floats your boat, and join me this week as we deep dive into the very disturbing case of Casey Anthony. So for those of you who live under a rock or are not really into true crime and are literally just watching this video because you're my friend and you want to support me, thank you. But let's talk about who Casey Anthony is. So Casey Anthony stepped into national headlines after a very suspicious disappearance of her daughter, Kaylee Anthony, in June of 2008. Now, Casey and her tumultuous family life and questionable criminal conduct really took over the news nationwide and definitely shocked the entire world. One of the most infamous cases that the United States has ever seen. Now, in true crime fashion, let's turn back the clocks and take a deep dive into the childhood of Casey Anthony and see what exactly it was that caused her to commit such shocking and horrific crimes and what formed the foundation of her suppressed empathy and emotional impulses. So Casey Anthony was born in Warren, Ohio, United States in March of 1986 to her parents, Sydney and George Anthony, and she did have one other sibling by the name of Lee. Interestingly enough, her father, George, was actually a former law enforcement worker, and Casey's childhood, like many others, was a super normal childhood. Now, Casey herself was known to be a pretty bright young girl who was kind of personable, and she did have a lot of friends throughout her childhood, but along with her outgoing personality, Casey seemed to form some relatively interesting habits from a very young age. Casey's friends say that she had a pattern of lying, and this kind of began in the early years of her high school and continued to develop as time went on. Now, let's kind of pause for a second here and talk about what pathological lying is. Well, pathological lying is a symptom of various personality disorders, and it's important for us to understand this as we take a deeper dive into Casey's life and really kind of understand who this was as a person. Pathological lying can stem from an array of different disorders like being antisocial, narcissistic, histrionic personality disorders, and other conditions such as borderline personality disorder do cause frequent lies as well. It is said that Casey's first big lie was when she was in high school at her high school graduation. It was at this time where her parents attended along with her grandparents, only to discover that Casey was not actually graduating, and as it turns out, she had stopped going to school altogether earlier on in that year and just literally continued on to act like everything was normal and that she would be graduating with her friends, and literally invited her parents to graduation and left it up to last minute for them to discover that, hey, I'm not graduating. Now, Casey was a relatively petite young girl, so the second lie kind of stemmed around the time when her parents started noticing that she was rapidly gaining weight. And so naturally, they were like, "Are you pregnant?" And of course, she said, "No, I'm not." But as time went on, she could not keep this a secret any longer, obviously because she's growing a human inside of her. So she did eventually tell them that she was pregnant. Now, they did still keep the secret from her brother Lee, and initially when I heard that, I thought it was really weird, but as I read further into this case, it didn't seem all that weird when I found out that Lee was really upset that his sister was pregnant, so upset to the point where when they told him about it, he actually didn't even show up to the birth of her daughter, Kaylee. Now, whether or not that was because they waited so long to tell him, or because he was just upset overall, not sure, but that's just a very interesting part of the case is that she definitely did not share this with anyone until the absolute last minute. Eventually, Casey gave birth to her daughter, Kaylee Anthony, on August 9th of 2005, who was an absolutely adorable little girl. Now, Casey did actually think of putting up her daughter for adoption initially, but her parents totally discouraged this, and for the next few years, she and her daughter Kaylee took up residency in her parents' house. Now, who the baby's father was did kind of remain a question in Casey's mind for a little bit, and she did point to a couple of different men, number one being her current boyfriend, Jesse Grund, and number two being a boyfriend that she said she previously dated who died in a car accident, allegedly. Now, Jesse, finding out she was pregnant, actually proposed to Casey that year, and it was on New Year's Eve, and he really just wanted to become a family, and he was super excited that Casey was pregnant and totally supported her through her decision. So he proposed to her in hopes that they could kind of unite and become a family and really take a next step in their lives. Jesse did this despite the questionable claims that he might not actually be the father. So he knew that there's a good chance he's not Kaylee's dad, but again, he loved Casey so much that he just really wanted to do anything and everything that he could to make them like a family unit. Casey, down the line, claimed that she ended up getting some help from a nanny, and this nanny's name was Zenaida Gonzalez, or Zanny the nanny. And when Casey was questioned about who the hell Zanny the nanny was and how she met her, she basically told her parents like, oh, I have this friend, he's an IT guy at Universal Studios, he has an ex-girlfriend who he introduced me to, her name's Zanny, he sends his kid to be watched by her, and he pays for the girl to also watch my kid Kaylee at the same time. Okay, so her parents were like, that's super weird. Why the hell would anyone pay for your child care? He's not your partner, he's not your family, whatever. But they just kind of brushed it off and were like, okay, whatever, like we're not even going to go there. Now, Cindy, Casey's mother, did recall Casey talking about Zanny a couple of times or at some point, but she definitely didn't recall ever meeting her, nor did anyone else in the family, which was really strange considering how close they all were and how close the parents were to their granddaughter specifically. Eventually, they did do a DNA test for Kaylee, and it was determined that Jesse was not, in fact, the father. But despite the results, and Jesse just being a really good guy, as I mentioned before, he just wanted to make things work. However, eventually in May of 2006, he did end up breaking it off with Casey, and the reason why he broke off the engagement was because he claims that Casey had recently become super erratic and just not herself at all. After a little bit of time had passed, Casey decided that she wanted to give love another shot. She wanted to put herself out there. So she went clubbing with her friends, and while she was out partying, she met an aspiring DJ by the name of Tony. Now, they hit it off right away, and the two started dating, and Casey would frequently bring her daughter Kaylee over to the apartment where Tony lived and shared a space with his roommates. At this point in time, the two of them were still living at Casey's parents' house, and Kaylee had her own room. She had a really good living situation. The grandparents totally took care of her and completely doubted on her because they just loved their granddaughter. Now, things started to become a little bit sketchy in mid-June of 2008. So there's this huge family event that happens, and Casey and her parents get into a massive argument, and it is at this point that she packs her things and she leaves with Kaylee, and she basically packs up enough bags that indicate that she will not be returning and tells her parents that she's going on a work trip to Tampa, Florida. One detail we know for sure is that the following day, June 16th of 2008, Kaylee would be seen alive for the very last time. So Casey told her parents, as I mentioned, that she was off on a work trip in Tampa, Florida. However, not to anyone's surprise, she was at her boyfriend Tony's house, and when she arrived there, she did not show up with Kaylee. Now, Casey would end up staying with her boyfriend for an entire month, and her parents would obviously frequently call, and they would want to talk to her granddaughter, but every time they would call, Casey had some form of excuse. She's in the shower, she's outside, she's with Zanny the nanny, that was a frequent one, or basically any excuse that would prevent her from getting on the phone and talking to her grandparents. It was during this month away from her parents that Casey began to party a lot. She would frequent clubs, she would go out to bars with her friends, and was even caught doing a sexy body contest at a local bar on camera. Now, because she was dating a DJ, she pretty much just went wherever he went, and so that obviously involves a lot of clubs because that was like his main source of his income. Casey would even post pictures of her all the time on MySpace showing her going out and partying and doing all this crazy stuff. And all of these actions were super suspicious to look back on because at the time, no one really knew Kaylee was missing, but when they looked back, it became increasingly suspicious looking at her behavior. At one point, she even went out and got a tattoo that said "Beautiful Life," which was super weird, and the whole public definitely eventually questioned that, but she was just overall making super questionable decisions and not at all worried considering she was a mother that's child had been totally missing. Now, Casey had been driving a car that her father owned as their main source of getting around, and it was her father George's car, and on July 13th of that same year, George received a letter that his car was in a tow yard. And so obviously they received this and were just completely shocked because this whole time they thought Casey had the car. So they rushed to the yard to pick up their vehicle in a state of complete shock. And it turns out that it had actually been abandoned in front of a cash advancement shop in Orlando about 10 days after anyone had ever seen Kaylee. Casey had been running out of gas on her way to cash a check, and by the time she got to the parking lot, there was actually no gas left in her tank, so she just left the car there. She cashed her check, and she decided to leave the car abandoned in the parking lot, and after a few days, some employees from the cash advancement shop looked in the parking lot and noticed that the car was just still sitting there, and no one had been there in days. So naturally, they call a company, and they get the car towed. When her father, George, went to retrieve the towed vehicle, he found Casey's purse inside of it along with Kaylee's car seat and some of her toys. George and the man at the yard were put off immediately when there was a smell lingering inside of the vehicle that smelled like organic matter decomposing. And the smell had been coming from the trunk of the vehicle, so immediate red flags. And the man from the yard actually said it smells like a dead body, which completely worried George right away. George takes the car home. He's super sketched out. He has no idea what the hell is going on. And when he gets home, he calls his wife, Cindy, to come out and check on the smell of the car. Now, Cindy comes out, she opens the car, and she agrees with George that there's a putrid, intense foul smell coming from the trunk. Now, she opens the trunk and she locates a trash bag. And at the time, she didn't open it. She just kind of tossed the garbage away and didn't really inquire about what was in it because it just smelled so bad. Then she said she used an entire bottle of Febreze on the inside of the car to try and diminish the putrid smell. The two of them decided to leave the car doors open and just kind of tried to air out the smell until they figured out what was going on. Alarmed by what has happened, Cindy tries to reach out to Casey's friend to help locate where the hell Casey was because she wasn't answering her parents. So they find out where she's staying and they go over there to get some answers. And while she was there, she forced Casey to come back home with her in order to try to get some more answers out of her. So when Cindy asks where her granddaughter is, Casey says she is with her nanny, Zanny. So Cindy's like, okay, well, tell me where she's located because I want to go see her. I haven't seen her in a month and I want to make sure everything's okay. And Casey just kind of continued to get really irritated and these questions were just bothering her so much that she just kept brushing it off, which made her mom even more suspicious. It is at this point where Cindy decides to call 911. Now, there are a total of 3 911 calls. On the first call, she said, verbatim, I have someone here who I need to be arrested in my home and I have a possible missing child. I have a 3-year-old who has been missing for a month. While she's waiting to hear back from police, she overhears Casey and her brother Lee talking about what's going on. Casey tells her brother Lee that she went to go meet up with Zanny the nanny and she took Kaylee and basically told Casey, you're not getting her back. Of course, her mom is totally shocked by this and now thinks that there's been a kidnapping, so she calls the police again. And the second time, she calls and demands that she speaks with an officer because she has just learned that her granddaughter has been kidnapped by her babysitter and has been missing for an entire month.
Emergency. I called a little bit ago, the deputy sheriff. I found out my granddaughter has been taken. She has been missing for a month. We're talking about a 3-year-old little girl. My daughter finally admitted that the baby's in the store. I need to find her.
Your daughter admitted that the baby is where?
But the babysitter took her a month ago. My daughter's been looking for her. I told you my daughter was missing for a month. I just found her today, but I can't find my granddaughter. And she just admitted to me that she's been trying to find her herself. There's something wrong. I found my daughter's car today, and it smells like there's been a dead body in the damn car.
Okay, what is the 3-year-old's name?
Kaylee, Caylee, Anthony.
Kaylee Anthony?
Yes.
How long has she been missing for?
I have not seen her since the 7th of June.
Is your daughter there?
Yes.
Can I speak with her?
Okay, Sheriff's Department, they want to talk to you. Answer the question. Hello?
Hello?
Yes.
Can you tell me what's going on a little bit?
I'm sorry?
Can you tell me a little bit what's going on?
My daughter's been missing for the last 31 days.
And you know who has her?
I know who has her. I've tried to contact her. I actually received a phone call today, now from a number that is no longer in service. I did get to speak to my daughter for about a minute.
Who has her? Do you have a name?
Her name is Zenraiva.
Casey talks with dispatchers, and at this point she remains super calm and basically tells them that, yeah, look, my daughter has been missing for a month. And the dispatchers are like, okay, well, why are you calling us literally 30 days later, not when she's just been missing in the first place. And she explains that she has been, quote, using other resources to try and search for her daughter, and tells police that she doesn't know where she is and that she left her with Zanny the nanny, but that the number that Zanny had for herself was no longer working. Now, Casey tells dispatchers that she had spoken to her daughter on July 9th and then again on July 15th when the nanny allowed her to speak with her daughter. She tells police the nanny's full name, and she also told her brother that the way she had been communicating with the Zanny this whole time was through MySpace, and that she had been using it often to contact Casey with instructions on how she could get her daughter back, and that she could rest assured because she would get Kaylee back on her birthday. Of course, her parents and her brother are very confused by this. For one, it's been so long since she said anything, and they literally had to force it out of her. And secondly, the story that she ended up telling made zero sense whatsoever. So her parents are really worried because she doesn't seem too concerned in the slightest for her daughter when everyone else is totally freaking out. So just as many other investigations start, police wanted to see where it was that Kaylee was last seen. So they asked Casey to take them to the last place she was dropped off, and Casey takes police to an apartment building that she claims the nanny lived in at the time and tells them that this is the last place I saw her. Casey provided a thorough description of the nanny to police, but one of the weird things she had mentioned in the description of Zanny the nanny was that she was a 10. Which I just found to be so weird. Like, okay, you're literally telling police that your nanny is hot? What relevance does that have? At this point, police go up to the apartment where Casey had claimed that the kidnapper lived, Zanny the nanny. But of course, no one has lived in this unit for months, and according to the owner of the building, no one even knew of anyone called Zenaida Gonzalez. So they tried to ask for surveillance footage from the building, to which they did eventually obtain, and of course, they never saw either the nanny coming in and out of the building or her daughter Kaylee at any time. Now, police are suspicious because now they know that Casey is lying, so they start investigating her further by asking her questions about what has been going on.
And I can tell you, just for a certainty, that everything you've told me so far has been a lie. I can tell you with a certainty, and let me explain why. Since I left you this morning, I've gone to every address that you've told me. I've looked up every name. I've talked to every person that you wanted me to talk to or tried to. I've reached out. I've talked to your ex-boyfriend. I've talked to Amy. I've talked to Tony. I came over here. I've already talked to all the employees. I found out all these names that you're giving me are people that either never worked here or have been fired here for a long time ago. Okay, so where we are right now is in a position that doesn't look very good for you. We can sit here and go back and forth all day long about I don't, I do, I don't, I do. It's pretty obvious that with everything that you've told us, nothing has been the truth. You know where she is. Now, my question to you is this: we need to find Kaylee. I understand that right now, Kaylee may not be in very good shape. You understand what I'm saying? She may not be the way we or the way your family last remembers her. We need to find out from you where Kaylee is.
I have no clue where she is.
Sure you do.
If I knew in any sense where she was, this wouldn't have happened at all.
You
it
know,
wouldn't have happened
listen,
whatsoever.
The stuff about Zanny, the caretaker or the nanny taking care of him,
It's the truth.
It's not the truth, because it went to the apartment complex. There's no person that ever lived there by that name. The apartment's been vacant since March, that same apartment. Now, the apartment that you pointed out to me, the two-story apartment, that's an old folks' home. It's right across the street from your ex-boyfriend's house, who you never mentioned. And you said you wrote the address down because it was across the street. That's a lie, because I've already talked to him, and we've already been by the house, and we've already looked at everything we need to look at over there. Everything you told us is a lie. She's either in a dumpster right now, she's buried somewhere, she's out there somewhere, and her rotten body is starting to decompose because of what you're telling us. And here's the problem: the longer this goes, the worse it's going to be for everyone. Everyone, the worse it's going to be for.
She tells police that she met the nanny through her job at Universal Studios. So they ask more about this job, and she basically leads investigators on a wild goose chase, first to the uninhabited apartment of Zanny the nanny, and then to Universal Studios, where she literally pretended to work. There's actually footage of her leading them to the studios and walking around aimlessly, showing them to the office. And once they were there, they asked her to see her boss. So Casey walked through Universal Studios, past security, and wandered around for a while before turning to the police and literally just being like, yeah, I don't work here. Like, just imagine how embarrassing that is. It's so embarrassing. Like, you're literally just walking around, you're like, oh shit, what am I going to tell them now? Yeah, guys, the jig is up. The jig is up. Although Casey had worked there at some point years ago, but she was fired and was just kind of telling people she still worked there. Now, after lying to investigators, Casey was arrested and charged with child neglect, lying to investigators, and interfering with a criminal investigation. So Cindy sits down with police and explains everything that she's aware of as far as the case goes, and the police question her about the smell that she had mentioned in the car. She basically tells police that there was an old box of pizza, there were maggots coming out of it, and she kind of attributes the smell to coming from the pizza box. But obviously, detectives question this because they're like, why did you call police and tell them that there's a dead body smell coming out of the car, and now you're telling us it's pizza? Like, I'm pretty sure that a slice of pepperoni rotting in the backseat of the car is a lot different than a 3-year-old body literally decomposing in your trunk. But okay. Cindy tells investigators that she was just mistaken, and the car gets taken into the station to be investigated further. At this point, they do bring in search dogs, and you guessed it, they pick up the scent in the back of the car where the smell had been coming from. The results come back confirming everyone's worst fear, which was that there were signs of a decomposing body and chloroform in the back of the trunk. Additionally, they found a hair. Now, the DNA testing confirmed that the hair had to have belonged to either Casey, Kaylee, or Cindy. However, when they tested it, they realized that because of the treatment that Cindy had had on her hair, it definitely couldn't be her. And because of the length of Casey's hair, it couldn't have been her. Therefore, it must have been Kaylee's. However, the hair that they had found had also had a decomposition band, which basically means that the hair they found had belonged to somebody who was already dead and had been decomposing at the time. It was at this time that investigators take the family computer to do some research and try to find some more answers about Kaylee's disappearance. So during the search, they end up finding that somebody in the household had been searching how to make chloroform. I mean, they just get dumber, right? So they questioned Cindy about this, and she said, yeah, it was me. She said she had been searching something else somewhat related to the search, and a recommended link popped up, and when she clicked it, it had been one of those articles that the police was talking about. Only she said she was searching about her dogs getting into bamboo in the backyard and wanting to know whether or not that would harm them, so it really did not add up as to why chloroform would be a related search to dogs and bamboo. Okay. So when they questioned her and further looked into it, the police actually realized that Cindy was not even home at the time that that search was made, and that in addition to her not being home, the only person who actually was there at the time was Casey Anthony. Basically, all signs point to you're guilty. Now, of course, investigators are getting a sense that at this point, not only is Casey lying, but that her mother is also lying in hopes of protecting her daughter. Of course, it's easy for them to quickly realize this because this is not their first rodeo, and this is not the first time that people in general are made aware of family members trying to protect their daughters or mothers or whoever it is in their family. So Casey's in jail at this point, and Cindy goes down to the jail to visit her daughter and kind of get some questions and help with the investigation. She specifically wanted to know more information about the nanny, Zanny. So she asked Casey for a description of the nanny in hopes that if police had to ask her, she could better point out who the person was. She also confronted Casey by saying that police told her that Casey herself could not even point out a photo of Zanny the nanny, and that was kind of suspicious considering how much time they spent together and how well she told the parents that she should know her own nanny. It was slowly becoming more obvious to investigators at this point that Zenaida Gonzalez, or Zanny the nanny, may have existed somewhere, but as far as this case went, she was non-existent. A month after Casey had been in jail, her parents George and Cindy decide to go and visit her in hopes of getting some more answers. They inform her that everyone around them is saying Kaylee is dead, so they're like, what is going on? Like, everyone thinks she's dead, everyone's saying she's dead, like, please, just tell us anything. And at this point, she just rolls her eyes and she's like, surprise, surprise. Literally what she said. So Cindy asks Casey, well, if you don't think she's dead, what do you think is wrong? Like, where do you think she is? And she's kind of hoping that her motherly instincts can kind of point them in the right direction, or really any direction at this point, to which Casey responds by telling her mom that she thinks she is not far and that she's basically not really worried at this point, and pretty much does it to just get her parents off of her back. Now, Casey's lawyer, Jose Bass, decides to write a letter to the sheriff's department in order to try to get Casey released while investigation is under the way. He basically tells them that she's been very cooperative with police. There's no direct evidence that supports that she might have harmed her own child, and the judge assigned to the case granted Casey with a $500,000 bail. Now, Casey's bail did end up getting paid, and she was released shortly after by an electronic monitoring device. She eventually moved back to her parents' home, and that is where she would be staying for that point in time moving forward. Now, of course, the media caught wind of this and immediately swarmed the parents' house. There were news networks, journalists, etc. The whole place was flooded with people wanting answers about Kaylee. I just imagine being her neighbor. You're literally taking out the trash and there's hundreds of people just yelling murderer and shit from the front yard. Like, God. Now, fast forward to August 29th, Casey was actually arrested again on a separate charge. This time, she was arrested for writing fraudulent checks in and around the area of $600 without consent or authorization from the other individual. So this time, her parents post a $500,000 bond and Casey is once again released from jail. So a few months after Casey is released in December of 2008, just under a mile away from where Casey had lived with her parents, a utility meter reader was out working his usual shift when he came across what looked like a skull. He didn't go up to it closely initially because he was kind of scared of what it might be, but he did call 911, and the first 911 call, they didn't even take him seriously. So he ended up having to call back and basically tell them, like, hey, I've actually gone up to it, I poked it with a stick, and I think this is really a human skull. Finally, investigators take it seriously, and they come out to see what the commotion is about. What investigators found was a skull wrapped in duct tape and a bag next to it with the remaining bones of a decomposed body. Close by to the remains, they had also located a children's Winnie of the Pooh blanket, and at this point had definitely put together that the body that was decomposing was that of a child's. About a week later, police come forward with the announcement that the remains that had previously been found by the meter worker do match the DNA of Kaylee Anthony. The police do move forward with the investigation by getting a warrant for the property in which George, Cindy, and Casey and her daughter Kaylee lived at the time. Now, knowing that one of the blankets located on site had matched the Winnie the Pooh themed room they had located in Anthony's house, things were quickly starting to add up for investigators, and they'd actually found items inside the house that were only sold in pairs. So they knew that whoever had killed Kaylee came from the household or was someone that Kaylee was close enough to actually let in the house. It is at this point that Casey is charged with first-degree murder. Now, around this time, we start to see the family really kind of fall apart. In these types of situations, it's very difficult for families already, and in this one particularly, the parents just simply did not agree on what happened and whether or not Casey had actually harmed her daughter. So Cindy, Casey's mom, was really in denial about what happened, or at least not willing to say anything bad about her daughter, and was really willing to protect her daughter at all costs, whereas George, her dad, was completely the opposite and felt strongly that his daughter was responsible for what happened, and this really drove a wedge between the couple. George had actually become so stressed about the entire situation that it began taking a huge toll on him. He was no longer staying at the home, he was mixing drugs and alcohol, and he was actually staying in a hotel when a third party ended up calling the police to let them know that George was behaving in a very odd way and that they should go in and do a wellness check on him. George had gone so far as to writing a suicide note where he had wrote, "Kaylee, here I come." So police go and do a wellness check, and thank God for whoever called because they did end up finding George and he was totally fine and they were able to come to the rescue. Finally, in May of 2011, the trial begins. Now, normally, because they were witnesses, the grandparents would not have been allowed in the courtroom at this time. However, because of their particular relationship to Kaylee, the court did allow it under the condition that they show zero emotion, which of course caused a lot of drama in the media because people not really knowing that that was like a condition that they had were just thinking like, these guys have no emotions. Clearly, they know what happened. So it stirred up a whole bunch of drama in the media and really drew negative attention towards the grandparents. For Casey, there were a lot of questions in this case about why she lied and how she was able to keep up with those lies for so long, both with authorities and with her parents and family as well. So everyone basically wanted to know, attorneys mostly wanted to know, how she could muster up the nerve to lie about such horrendous things. So of course, Casey had an explanation, as many do, for why she was able to lie and not really have any difficulty with it. Casey told prosecutors that her father George had molested her as a child starting around the age of 8, and it had really forced her to lie because she was told not to tell anyone about it and just keep it between the two of them. So because of this, she claims that her lying had become a habit and had become really easy for her. George, however, took the stand and he did defend himself, claiming that these accusations were false and that he had never inappropriately touched his daughter. Now, this was, of course, the first time George was hearing this and hearing her make these accusations, so it really took him by surprise and really had an impact on the family.
Is more dramatic than the day before, and that was certainly the case here. But we are watching to see today if Ms. Anthony herself will get up, stand up, and take that stand, even if it's for just a brief direct examination, because otherwise it would be hard to trump the drama that we saw yesterday.
3 years of sorrow and strain spilled over the witness stand as George Anthony was reduced to a shattered man.
You learned in December of 2008 that the remains of your granddaughter were found. What effect did that have on you?
A deep hurt inside, and seeing what my wife and my son went through.
Up to that moment, had you held out the hope that Kaylee would be found alive?
Absolutely. Every day from July 15th until the day we were told it was Kaylee.
Casey was stone-faced, watching her father sobbing openly in court for the first time. His silent grief grew worse during sidebar until finally the lawyers took notice and took pity.
Need a break, Mr. Anthony?
No, sir, I need to get through this. I need to have something inside of me get through this.
So this guy is losing his granddaughter, now he's losing his daughter, and his wife is completely taking the side of his daughter who he thinks killed his granddaughter. So this guy's just losing it, and he's going through a really hard time. Now, whether or not I believe these claims of Casey, I'm really not sure. It seems like there's kind of a pattern with these types of people and them lying to really draw attention away from what they've done. But we can't exactly rule that out because it hasn't been proven otherwise. Or really, it hasn't been proven whether it's true or not true. So I won't really comment on that, but I'm just going to say that it is not uncommon for people in her situation to make up something to draw attention away from the fact that they just did something really bad. Now, by the end of the trial, the prosecution had determined that Casey Anthony had been the one to kill her daughter, Kaylee. Their theory was that she killed her daughter by using chloroform to knock her out and then put duct tape around her mouth to suffocate her. It was at this point they said that Casey must have put her daughter's body in the trunk and left it there. Prosecutors believe that Casey's body was left in the trunk until the following day when Casey decided to dispose of her remains in a nearby forest. So that was their story. Now, the defense did not have much to go off of, clearly, so they said that Cindy was at work and George and Casey were searching for Kaylee. They claimed that when George found Kaylee, she was inside of the pool at the parents' house and that she had drowned. They then got into an argument and her parents blamed her for allowing Kaylee to be left alone long enough to wander off into the pool by herself without supervision. Now, if you watched Nancy Grace or any other major media sources that covered this case, they tried to basically say that Kaylee loved to swim. They had lots of photos of her swimming and all that. And they were always conscious to remove that ladder that sits on the outside of the pool so that if she did want to swim, she couldn't just crawl up and go on her own. She would always have to have someone put the ladder there and supervise her while she was swimming. So the defense basically said that when George found out that his granddaughter had drowned, he told Casey that, your mother will never forgive you for this. We need to get rid of the body. And at that point, they wanted to prevent her from ever finding out and went ahead and disposed of the body. Now, Cindy has her own theories about what happened. She basically says that she thinks her granddaughter drowned and that her daughter was just really shocked about what happened to her own daughter, and that at this point she just removed the body and disposed of it in a state of shock and a state of confusion and not really knowing what to do. She kind of claims that, based on everything that was going on, she really wasn't in the right mindset and that might have caused her to do such a thing. George, on the other hand, the only sane one in the household, has his own theory, which is probably the most interesting theory in my opinion, but is also very wild when you think about it because it almost makes too much sense.
Possibly some kind of drug or something like that. I mean, there's been speculation about Xanax or whatever it might be.
So you think it was like a chemical babysitter? We need to sedate this child, so what? So she could leave? What would be the purpose of sedating the child?
To go out and have a good time, to be with friends, to have this life that she didn't have with Kaylee. I mean, some freedom that she wanted. That's what I feel.
He believed that his daughter was drugging Kaylee the entire time that she had her out of their household with, you guessed it, Xanax, aka Zanny, or Zanny the Nanny. George says that Zanny never existed and that it was a drug that she would issue to her child to help her fall asleep whenever she wanted to kind of do her own thing. And George claimed that because of the effects of the drug, it basically worked as a babysitter because just like she wanted, Kaylee was off her back and she could pretty much do whatever she wanted. Now, the trial was really confusing at a lot of times, and that's because the defense tried desperately to pin things on George, and they really just went about every excuse you can think of, which eventually led to a blame game that pretty much went on between the prosecution and defense team. It seems to me that they were really grasping at straws, and George was just like the easiest guy to pin the blame on. But finally, on July 5th, the jury finished deliberating. The entire world gathered to watch Casey as she was put behind bars. I actually remember my grandmother watching this and just being so excited to see her go to jail. But plot twist, Casey was found not guilty. I know, it is so frustrating. People were enraged about this and simply could not believe that this woman was getting away with killing her own daughter. They had charged Casey, but instead of murder, she was charged with 4 misdemeanor charges for giving false information to police investigators, and the judge sentenced Casey to a total of 1 year and just $1,000 in fines, which is so messed up because for killing your daughter, the only price you have to pay is $1,000. Shameful. Not only that, but she had already done 3 years and she had been credited for good behavior. So she's credited for 3 years and she's credited for good behavior. So unfortunately, Casey was released on July 17th of that same year. Jurors received death threats, media was completely pissed off, and the entire world hated Casey and the decision that the court had made. It was really hard for people to accept this decision because to everyone watching, it seemed super obvious that Casey had done it. But unfortunately, she did go through the due process and the courts decided otherwise. However, the story does not end there. When the case was over, Casey owed her lawyer Jose a lot of money. But seeing as though her good old friend Universal Studios was not exactly looking to hire her at the time, Casey had no money and she did end up filing bankruptcy. But she still wanted to pay her old friend Jose somehow, so Casey paid him back in sexual favors. There was even one member of the law office who actually walked in on Casey and Jose and saw Casey naked in his office. Now, in 2017, more information did come out after they did a full search on the property, and what they had found was that a search had been done on Casey's computer, which was search for foolproof suffocation. Now, of course, this search was done with intent, and another thing that was done with intention was her deleting her entire browsing history 48 hours before she had been arrested. I mean, all around, she is one of the most obvious and idiotic people I have ever come across, and I watch a lot of true crime. Years later, of course, Casey did some interviews and she gave more stories yet again about what had actually happened and really just confused the public even further. But to place the cherry on top, Casey decided she wanted to pursue a career in, that's right, private investigation.
He is now living in Palm Beach with this man, renowned private investigator Patrick McKenna, as seen exclusively in these pictures on dailymail.com.
He's an older gentleman, divorced. He has 2 children. As far as romantic involvement, we don't know that much about it.
McKenna was the lead investigator on Casey's defense team, and he has worked on other high-profile cases around the world.
His big claim to fame really was working for the defense on the O.J. Simpson case.
As Crime Watch Daily first reported, McKenna helped Casey start up a photography business in Palm Beach. Not so much to shoot pretty pictures, but to become a private eye herself.
One of the reasons I'm so good at my job is because I'm taking everything that the state tried to use against me, like my Facebook and pictures and all that stuff that they distorted. I now go through and research people's backgrounds and put everything together in a good way.
Which was quite possibly the biggest slap in the face to her daughter that you could possibly imagine. I mean, you literally get away with murder. We get it. You don't need to further rub it in by getting a job as a private investigator. This story has got to be one of the saddest ones I have ever come across, and Casey really had no remorse for her actions, and it's really quite disturbing considering the fact that she did what she did. The world hated her, they still hate her, and Casey herself has said it verbatim. She gives zero fucks who likes her or who dislikes her because she got away with a huge crime and she is now living kid-free without any consequences. But that is it for today's story, you guys. I really wish I had a better ending I could tell you, and I wish I could tell you she was locked up in a really small cell eating ramen noodles and PB&J sandwiches, but unfortunately she is scot-free, living her life, her best life. And I would love to hear what you guys think about this case in the comments below. Say guilty in the comments if you think she's guilty, and comment not guilty if you do not think she is. But if you do think she's not guilty, I would love to hear why, so please leave an explanation in the comments below. And thank you all so much for joining me this week. I look forward to seeing you next week on another episode of Mostly Crime with Mai.